Look at any major city in the world. Notice something strange? The first floors of almost every building built before 1900 are buried. Not settled, not sinking, buried. Windows that were meant to let in light now sit below street level, their glass panes staring into darkness. Doors that once opened to the street now require you to descend a flight of stairs just to reach them. Basements that architects supposedly designed as basements have ceiling heights of 20 feet, ornate moldings, and chandeliers. Does this make any sense? Why would anyone build a basement more luxurious than a penthouse? Why would every city on earth have the same problem? New York, London, Paris, Moscow, Istanbul, Beijing, all buried, all at the same time. All explained away with the same convenient excuse. The streets were raised. But raised with what? Where did millions of tons of soil suddenly come from in every major city simultaneously? And why would any civilization willingly bury their own architecture? The official story crumbles the moment you examine it. They tell us that cities simply accumulated dirt over time, that horse manure and garbage piled up so high that people just built new streets on top of the old ones. But here's what they don't tell you. The buildings show no signs of gradual burial. There are no layers of construction, no evidence of incremental street raising, no documentation of this massive undertaking in city records. Instead, what we find in photograph after photograph from the 1800s are buildings already half buried, sitting in what looks like dried mud, with workers not building up but digging out, excavating, recovering, not constructing, but uncovering what was already there. The narrative doesn't just have holes, it's completely inverted. What if everything we've been told about the 19th century is a cover story? What if the people in those photographs weren't building a new world, but moving into the ruins of an old one? Consider the time frame they expect you to believe. According to official history, nearly all the grand architecture we see in major cities worldwide was constructed in an impossibly narrow window, roughly between 1850 and 1915. In just 65 years, humanity supposedly went from living in wooden shacks and dirt roads to suddenly erecting thousands of massive stone buildings, each one featuring impossible levels of craftsmanship, with perfectly carved columns, intricate facades, soaring ceilings, and engineering that modern contractors struggle to replicate even with advanced machinery. They want you to believe that people who had just invented the light bulb somehow coordinated global construction projects of unprecedented scale and complexity. That civilizations that had barely mastered steam power were casually building structures that required precision measurement, advanced mathematics, and an understanding of acoustics, resonance, and atmospheric physics that we're only beginning to comprehend today. The timeline doesn't just seem tight, it seems physically impossible. But let's say you accept the timeline. Let's say you believe that all this construction happened exactly when they say it did. That still doesn't explain the technology. Walk into any major building constructed before 1900 and look up. Really look. The ceilings soar 30, 40, sometimes 60 feet above you. The acoustic properties are perfect. Whisper on one side of a domed hall and someone 100 feet away hears you clearly. No amplification needed. No modern sound engineering required. These buildings stay cool in summer without air conditioning. They stay warm in winter with minimal heating. Air circulates through them naturally, pulled by pressure differentials and temperature gradients that the architects supposedly calculated by hand, without computers, without testing facilities, without any of the tools we consider essential today. Every window is positioned to maximize natural light while minimizing heat gain. Every room breathes. Every space feels alive. Now ask yourself, how did people who were still dying of cholera because they didn't understand basic sanitation suddenly master thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and architectural acoustics at a level we can't match with all our technology? The craftsmanship itself presents another impossibility. Look closely at the stonework on these buildings, not with your eyes, with a straight edge, with a level, with precision instruments. The tolerances are absurd. Massive granite blocks weighing several tons each, fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. No mortar, no cement, just stone on stone, cut so exactly that they've stood for over a century without shifting, without settling, without any of the normal degradation you'd expect. The official explanation? Skilled craftsmen with hand tools, chisels and hammers. Patient workers who spent years carving each block by hand, measuring by eye, fitting pieces together through trial and error. But here's what demolishes that explanation. There are too many of them. Thousands of these buildings. Tens of thousands. All built simultaneously across every continent. All featuring the same impossible precision. All supposedly crafted by an army of master stonemasons who materialized out of nowhere, did their work, and then vanished completely, leaving no descendants, no schools, no tradition of their craft that survived into the modern era. And then there are the details that make no sense from a functional standpoint. Doors that are 12 feet tall in buildings where the average person was 5.5 feet. Why? Hallways wide enough to drive a truck through. Why? Windows that start 8 feet off the ground, requiring ladders to see out of them. Why? Staircases with steps so deep and so tall that climbing them is genuinely difficult for a normal-sized human. Why? The standard response is that these were built for aesthetic purposes, to create a sense of grandeur and importance. But that explanation falls apart when you realize how consistent these proportions are and how impractical they make the buildings for actual human use. It's not grandeur. It's wrong scale. As if the people using these buildings weren't the ones they were designed for. As if we are children walking through spaces built for adults. Or tenants living in apartments we inherited but didn't build. Consider what we find in the basements of these structures. Not simple storage spaces but vast underground networks, tunnels connecting building to building, sometimes spanning entire city blocks, elaborate ventilation systems with shafts that go down hundreds of feet. Massive cisterns and water channels with no clear purpose, far too large for the populations they supposedly served. Room after room of carefully constructed underground space that city planners today classify as sewer systems or maintenance tunnels, but which show evidence of much more sophisticated design. These aren't hasty additions or afterthoughts. They're integral to the structures themselves, built with the same precision and care as everything above ground. And here's what's strange. Almost none of them appear on original construction documents. They're just there, discovered during renovations, found by accident when digging for new construction, existing beneath our feet, undocumented and unexplained. Let's talk about the world's fairs. Between 1851 and 1915, over 100 major expositions were held worldwide. Each one featured dozens or even hundreds of massive temporary buildings, constructed in months, sometimes weeks. The official story says these were built from plaster and wood frames, flimsy structures designed to last only for the duration of the fair before being demolished. But look at the photographs. These weren't tents and temporary pavilions. They were palatial complexes with domed roofs, classical columns, ornate sculptures, and electrical systems. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the White City, covered over 600 acres and included over 200 buildings. Official records claim it was designed and built in just 2 years by a workforce that had to be trained from scratch because almost none of them had construction experience. In 2 years, they supposedly erected what amounted to an entirely new city, complete with working infrastructure, electrical lighting throughout, a functioning transit system, and architectural details that would take modern builders a decade to plan, let alone execute. Then, within a year of the fair's closing, nearly all of it was gone. Demolished, burned, erased. Does this make any sense? Here's what makes even less sense. The photographs of these fairs being demolished show something disturbing. The buildings aren't being carefully dismantled like temporary structures. They're being destroyed like permanent ones. Wrecking crews attacking solid walls. Controlled burns consuming what appear to be substantial buildings. And in image after image, You can see what's beneath the supposed plaster facades: brick, stone, and iron. Real construction, permanent materials. The official explanation is that these materials were used for support structures, with plaster overlays for decoration. But that raises an obvious question. Why build permanent support structures for temporary buildings? Why use expensive materials for something you plan to destroy in months? And why does the demolition look so much more difficult than it should be if these were just wood and plaster? The pattern repeats itself in cities around the world. Major fires break out with suspicious regularity in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Chicago, 1871, Boston, 1872, Seattle, 1889, Spokane, 1889. The list goes on and on. Each fire destroys huge swaths of the city. Each fire burns hot enough to reduce stone buildings to rubble. Each fire is explained by similar causes: accidental ignition, high winds, dry conditions. But the destruction goes beyond what you'd expect from normal fires. Stone doesn't burn, brick doesn't burn. Yet these fires somehow reduced entire districts of stone and brick buildings to ashes and debris. And in almost every case, the fires destroyed the oldest parts of the city, the areas with the most elaborate architecture, the districts with the deepest basements, and the most mysterious underground networks. After each fire, reconstruction happened quickly, suspiciously quickly. New buildings rose on the ruins, but they were different, simpler, less ornate, built to a different scale, as if the fire wasn't a disaster but an opportunity. A chance to erase what came before and replace it with something new. Archives burned too: libraries, record halls, museums. Between 1850 and 1920, an astonishing number of repositories containing historical documents were destroyed by fire. The Library of Congress twice, the New York State Library, the San Francisco Public Library, municipal archives in dozens of major cities. Sometimes the fires were blamed on accidents, sometimes on arson by unknown perpetrators. But the result was always the same: vast quantities of historical records, maps, architectural plans, and genealogical documents gone forever. What's particularly strange is the timing. These fires happened during a period when fire prevention technology was rapidly improving, when cities were investing heavily in fire departments and water systems specifically to prevent such disasters. Yet the fires kept happening, almost as if they were intentional. Almost as if someone wanted certain records to disappear. Now consider the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were transported from eastern cities to the American West and Midwest. The official story presents this as a charitable program to find homes for orphans from overcrowded cities. But the numbers don't add up. 200,000 orphans? In a country with a relatively small population? Where did they all come from? The standard explanation points to poverty, disease, and immigration. Parents dying of typhoid or cholera, leaving children behind. But even accounting for disease and immigration, the sheer volume of orphans seems impossible, and the records are maddeningly incomplete. Most of these children have no documentation before they appeared in orphanages, no birth records, no parents' names, no clear origin stories. They simply existed, in huge numbers, needing to be distributed across the country to families who often had no idea where these children came from. Photographs from the mid to late 1800s show something even stranger. Cities that appear partially empty, streets lined with magnificent buildings, but very few people. Vast urban landscapes with infrastructure for populations far larger than what census records indicate actually lived there. You see it in images of New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and countless smaller cities. The buildings are there, the streets are there, the lampposts, the sidewalks, the parks, all there. But where are the people? The official population figures for these cities in the 1850s and 1860s seem absurdly low given the infrastructure visible in photographs. It's as if the cities came first and the population filled in later. As if people moved into spaces that were already built, already waiting, already equipped for far more inhabitants than actually arrived. This pattern isn't limited to America. Look at photographs of European cities from the same period. London, with its miles of underground tunnels, far more extensive than the subway system that supposedly created them. Paris, with its catacombs and underground quarries that official history claims were dug to provide building stone, but which show signs of much more sophisticated planning and purpose. Moscow, with entire underground levels that extend far deeper than any metro construction would require. In every case, the official explanation focuses on what we can see above ground, while ignoring the vast structures below. And in every case, the timeline gets fuzzy when you start asking when these underground networks were actually built, and by whom. Let's examine the technology question more carefully. The buildings, we're told, were constructed in the mid to late 1800s, feature engineering solutions that shouldn't have been possible with the tools and knowledge available at the time. Take ventilation. Modern buildings use complex HVAC systems with fans, ducts, filters, and computer controls to move air through structures. But the old buildings didn't need any of that. They breathe naturally. Air comes in through carefully positioned lower vents, rises as it warms, and exits through higher vents and cupolas, creating a continuous flow without any mechanical assistance. This requires precise understanding of thermodynamics, air pressure differentials, and building physics. The calculations alone would be formidable even with modern computers. Yet we're supposed to believe that 19th century architects did all this by hand, by intuition, by trial and error. And got it right, every time, in thousands of buildings across the world. The heating systems are even more puzzling. Many of these old buildings used radiant heat, with hot water or steam pipes running through the walls and floors. But the efficiency of these systems is remarkable. They heat evenly, without hot spots or cold spots, maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout massive spaces with minimal fuel consumption. Modern engineers have tried to replicate these systems and found it surprisingly difficult. The pipe layouts require precise mathematical modeling to ensure even heat distribution. The pressure calculations have to account for thermal expansion, flow rates, and structural stress. Get it wrong, and the system either doesn't heat properly or the pipes burst. Yet the old systems work perfectly, designed and installed by people who supposedly had no formal training in thermodynamics and no way to test their designs before implementation. The acoustic engineering is perhaps the most impressive. Concert halls built in the 1800s remain the gold standard for sound quality. Modern acousticians study them, measure them, try to understand how they work. The shape of the walls, the materials used, the placement of reflective and absorptive surfaces all combine to create perfect sound throughout the space. No dead zones, no echo, no distortion. Just pure, clear sound that reaches every seat with the same quality and volume. This level of acoustic design requires sophisticated understanding of wave physics, resonance, and material properties. It requires the ability to predict how sound will behave in a space before that space exists. Today, we use computer modeling and scale testing to achieve results that still often fall short of these 19th century halls. How did builders supposedly working with pencil and paper surpass what our best technology can achieve? Then there's the electrical system mystery that nobody wants to discuss. Walk through any major city and look up at the old buildings. See those metal spires, those ornate copper domes, those decorative metal fixtures on the roofs? Official history calls them lightning rods or purely aesthetic elements. But look closer. They're not random decorations. They're positioned with mathematical precision. They're connected to metal frameworks that run through the entire building. They're made of specific conductive materials, often copper or a copper alloy, and they're always at the highest points of the structure. Now here's what's interesting. Many of these buildings were supposedly constructed before widespread electrical systems existed, yet they all have these metal elements already integrated into their design, not added later, built in from the beginning, as if the buildings themselves were designed to interact with electricity in ways we no longer understand. Some researchers have proposed that these structures were part of a wireless power transmission system, that the metal spires weren't just decorative but functional, designed to capture atmospheric electricity and distribute it throughout the building. Sound insane? Consider what Nikola Tesla demonstrated in the early 1900s. He successfully transmitted electrical power wirelessly over considerable distances. He proposed a global system of towers that could provide free electricity to the entire world by tapping into the Earth's natural electrical field. He built a tower, Wardenclyffe, to prove the concept. Then his funding mysteriously disappeared. The project was shut down, the tower was demolished, and the technology was buried and dismissed as impractical. But what if it wasn't impractical? What if it worked? What if buildings all over the world were already designed to use this system? And Tesla wasn't inventing something new, but rediscovering something old. Look at the street lamps in photographs from the 1800s. They appear in cities long before those cities had electrical power plants. Official history explains them as gas lamps. But examine the design. Many of them have no visible gas lines, no fuel storage, no obvious source of power. They just stand there, ornate metal poles with glass globes on top, providing light. Some researchers have found that these lamp posts are often placed in geometric patterns, positioned at specific intervals that correspond to wavelength frequencies. They're made of conductive metals. They're grounded into the earth. And in many cases they connect to underground metal networks that official history claims were water or sewer pipes, but which show none of the corrosion or mineral deposits you'd expect from carrying water. What if these weren't gas lamps at all? What if they were receivers in a wireless power grid that no longer functions because we've lost the knowledge of how to operate it? The water systems present similar anomalies. Old buildings often have elaborate water features, fountains that operate without visible pumps, plumbing that delivers water to upper floors without the pressure systems we consider necessary today. Official explanations point to gravity-fed systems, water towers, and clever pipe arrangements. But the sophistication required to make these systems work is substantial. Water has to be lifted, pressure has to be maintained, airlocks have to be prevented, and all of this has to happen reliably without the electric pumps and pressure regulators we use now. The old systems accomplished this through design alone, through understanding of fluid dynamics so thorough that the buildings themselves became machines, using differences in temperature, air pressure, and gravity to move water exactly where it needed to go. This isn't primitive technology. This is advanced engineering that we've largely forgotten how to replicate. Let's return to those buried first floors because the implications go deeper than just cosmetic inconvenience. When a building's ground floor is buried under 10 or 15 feet of soil, everything changes. The foundation that was designed to support the structure is now under different stress. The drainage systems that were meant to channel water away from the building no longer work as intended. The windows that provided light and ventilation are blocked. The doors that allowed access are sealed. Any building subjected to this kind of burial should show serious structural problems: cracked foundations, water damage, settling, instability. Yet these buildings stand perfectly sound. They've been buried for over a century, and they show no signs of the stress that such burial should cause. Why? Because they were designed to be buried. Or more accurately, they were designed to function at their current level, and what we think of as burial is actually the original ground level. The part we see above ground is only the upper portion of structures that extend much deeper than we realize. City records offer no help in understanding this. When you search for documentation about street-level changes, you find vague references and incomplete records. Cities claim they raised streets for drainage or to accommodate new sewer systems, but the paperwork detailing this massive undertaking is mysteriously sparse. Where are the work orders? Where are the contractor records? Where are the before and after surveys that any such project would require? In most cases, they don't exist. What you find instead are mentions of excavation projects, digging out, removing fill, clearing away soil that was already there. The language is telling. They weren't raising the streets. They were lowering them back down, trying to reclaim what had been buried. But buried by what? And when? The mudflood hypothesis proposes an answer that official history refuses to consider. a global catastrophic event in the early to mid-1800s that buried cities under layers of mud and sediment. Survivors emerged to find their world transformed, their buildings half buried, their infrastructure destroyed. The people who moved into these cities afterward weren't the builders. They were refugees, survivors, inheritors of a world they didn't create and didn't fully understand. This explains the impossible construction timeline. It explains the buried first floors. It explains the advanced technology that seems out of place for the era. It explains the orphan trains and the missing population records. It explains the suspiciously convenient fires that destroyed evidence. It explains why photographs from the 1800s show cities that look partially abandoned, partially excavated, partially reclaimed, rather than newly built. But if this happened, if there was a reset event that destroyed a previous civilization, then where is the evidence in the historical record? Where are the accounts of this catastrophe? The answer is disturbing. They were erased. Deliberately, systematically. Consider the world's fairs again, but from a different angle. These expositions weren't showcases of new technology. They were cataloging events, opportunities to gather the remnants of the old world's knowledge, to display the technology that survivors had inherited but no longer understood. The buildings at these fairs weren't temporary constructions. They were existing structures, remnants of the previous civilization, repurposed for exhibition. That's why they looked so substantial. That's why demolishing them required such effort. And that's why they had to be destroyed afterward, because they were evidence, physical proof of a world that the new authorities wanted everyone to forget. The timeline of these fairs is revealing. They begin in 1851, right after the mysterious period of the 1840s about which historical records are strangely quiet. They proliferate through the late 1800s and early 1900s, a period of supposed rapid advancement, but also a period of massive construction that makes no sense given the available workforce and technology. Then they largely stop after World War I, just as the last generation that might have remembered the old world was dying off. The fairs served a dual purpose. They harvested the technology and knowledge of the previous civilization, while simultaneously creating a narrative that this was all new, all modern, all the achievement of contemporary industry and innovation. They took what was inherited and claimed it was invented. They turned discovery into creation. They rewrote history in real time. Examine the photographs from these expositions carefully. Look at the people. Notice how many are simply standing and staring, not with pride of creation but with wonder of discovery. Notice the scale of the buildings compared to the crowds. Notice how the surrounding areas often look undeveloped, as if these magnificent structures appeared in the middle of nowhere. Notice the mud. Almost every World's Fair photograph shows mud, lots of it. Officially explained as poor drainage or wet weather, but the mud appears to be several feet deep in some images. It clings to the lower portions of buildings. It buries pathways and covers what should be ground-level features. It looks less like construction site mess and more like excavation site reality. Like these buildings were being dug out of the earth, not built on top of it. The technology displayed at these fairs is another clue. Electrical exhibits that supposedly demonstrated new inventions often showed devices that worked perfectly the first time, without the years of trial and error that real invention requires. Mechanical systems of incredible complexity that apparently sprang fully formed from the minds of inventors. Architectural techniques that had no precedent and no clear developmental pathway. The official narrative presents a story of genius after genius, having breakthrough after breakthrough in rapid succession. The alternative explanation is simpler. They were reverse engineering what they found. They were learning how the old world's technology worked and presenting that knowledge as if it were original innovation. Now let's address the population question more directly. Census records from the 1800s show something strange when you map them against infrastructure. Cities had buildings, streets and systems designed for populations of hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. But the census counted only tens of thousands of residents. Official explanations point to rapid immigration and population growth filling these cities over the following decades. But the timing doesn't work. The infrastructure existed first. The population came later. It's backwards from how cities develop organically. When a city grows naturally, infrastructure struggles to keep pace with population growth. You see overcrowding, inadequate services, strained systems. But in the 1800s, you see the opposite. Ample space, excessive capacity, infrastructure waiting for people to use it, as if the cities were built for populations that no longer existed, and new populations had to be imported to fill the void. The orphan trains fit into this picture. 200,000 children with unclear origins distributed across a depopulated landscape to families eager for workers and heirs. Official history frames this as charity, as finding homes for the unfortunate. But what if it was repopulation? What if these children were survivors, remnants of the previous civilization's population, being redistributed to fill empty spaces and restart society? That would explain the lack of documentation. That would explain why so few of them had clear family histories. That would explain the sheer scale of the program. And it would explain why it ended in 1929. Right as the generation that remembered the old world was dying out and the new narrative was becoming established. Consider the cultural reset that happened during this same period. Folk traditions that had existed for centuries suddenly disappeared. Languages that had been widely spoken faded rapidly. Architectural styles that had been universal were abandoned almost overnight. Official history attributes this to modernization, to progress, to the natural evolution of culture. But the speed and completeness of the change suggests something more deliberate. It suggests coordinated effort to erase the old and establish the new. It suggests that someone wanted to make sure that knowledge of the previous world didn't survive, that the new population wouldn't question the narrative they were being given, that history would be whatever the authorities said it was. The education system that emerged during this period reinforced this narrative. Before the late 1800s, education was decentralized, variable, often conducted at home or in small community schools. Then suddenly, across the Western world, standardized public education systems appeared. Compulsory attendance, unified curriculum, centralized control. The official explanation focuses on the benefits: literacy, equality of opportunity, preparation for industrial work. But there was another effect: standardization of knowledge, control of information, the ability to teach a single version of history to an entire generation and eliminate competing narratives. Children who might have heard different stories from grandparents were now spending most of their time in institutions that taught them the approved version of reality. Within a few generations, the old knowledge was gone, replaced by what the textbooks said. Architecture provides more evidence of the reset. Compare buildings constructed before roughly 1850 with those built after 1900. The earlier structures show incredible sophistication, impossible precision, advanced engineering. The later structures, while often beautiful, are fundamentally simpler. They lack the acoustic properties. They lack the natural climate control. They lack the integrated electrical systems. They lack the perfect stone fitting and the elaborate underground networks. It's as if there's a gap in capability. The very early buildings show mastery. The later buildings show competence. But the middle period, the supposed era of construction, shows neither. It shows people working with what they found, maintaining what existed, but not really understanding how to recreate it. The few buildings actually constructed in the late 1800s with genuine new design are noticeably inferior to the older structures around them, despite supposedly having better tools and more advanced knowledge. The materials themselves tell a story. Analyze the stone in pre-1850 buildings, and you often find types of granite or marble that don't match local quarries. The official explanation is that stone was imported, transported hundreds or thousands of miles for construction. But the logistics of moving thousands of tons of stone with 19th century technology seem impossible. The cost would be astronomical. The time required would extend construction timelines beyond what records indicate. Yet the stone is there, perfectly carved, perfectly fitted, from sources that make no practical sense, unless the buildings were much older than claimed. Unless they were built when different transportation methods existed. Unless they're remnants of a global civilization that had capabilities we've lost. Then there's the question of documentation. We have extensive records of construction projects from the 20th century, detailed plans, progress photographs, worker testimonies, budget reports, engineering specifications. But for the massive construction supposedly happening in the late 1800s, the documentation is surprisingly thin. You find dedications and opening ceremonies well documented. You find general descriptions in newspapers. But the actual construction process is poorly recorded. Where are the detailed architectural plans? Where are the engineering calculations? Where are the construction photographs showing these magnificent buildings being raised from the ground up? In most cases, they don't exist. What you find instead are photographs of buildings that look already complete, being excavated from earth, being cleaned, being refurbished. The photographic record shows excavation and restoration far more often than actual construction. The narrative control becomes obvious when you look at how information about this period is presented. History books focus on political events, wars, industrial development. They skim over the physical transformation of cities with vague references to progress and growth. They don't dwell on the details because the details don't support the official timeline. Academic historians who question the standard narrative find their careers threatened. Researchers who point out the technological impossibilities are dismissed as conspiracy theorists. The evidence is there, visible to anyone who looks, but the system has been designed to ensure that most people don't look, and those who do are discredited before they can change the consensus. We live in cities we didn't build. We walk through structures we don't fully understand. We use technology whose underlying principles we've forgotten. The buildings around us aren't monuments to our ancestors' achievements. They're remnants of someone else's civilization. We are not the builders. We are the inheritors. We are the survivors of a reset that wiped away the old world and installed a new order in its place. The evidence is buried under our streets, hidden in plain sight in the architecture around us, encoded in the impossible timelines and technological paradoxes that official history can't explain. We are living in the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than ours, a civilization that was deliberately erased from memory, leaving only fragments and contradictions for those willing to see them. The reset wasn't just physical. It was mental, cultural, historical. Those who survived were given a new past, a manufactured history that explained the world they found themselves in without revealing what had been lost. The orphans were the clean slate, children with no memory of before, who could be raised to believe whatever story they were told. The fires were the erasure, burning the evidence that might contradict the new narrative. The world's fairs were the rebranding, taking the achievements of the lost civilization and presenting them as modern innovation. And the education system was the enforcement mechanism, ensuring that each new generation learned only the approved version of history and never questioned the impossibilities embedded in that story. But the truth persists, in the buried floors, in the oversized doors, in the acoustic perfection of concert halls, in the wireless power systems disguised as decoration, in the water features that work without modern pumps, in the underground networks that serve no official purpose, in the mud-covered photographs, in the orphan trains, in the missing records, in the suspicious fires, in the impossible construction timelines, in the technological sophistication that shouldn't exist. The evidence is everywhere for those with eyes to see it. We have been lied to, not in small ways, not about minor details, but about the fundamental nature of our world and our place in it. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are shadows living in the ruins of giants. And until we acknowledge what was taken from us, we can never reclaim what was lost.